Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. The fact that Barry is a controlling figure likely figures into the disposal of Suzanne's remains. That's if he was involved. He would want control over that too. It's a mistake to assume human remains once left somewhere aren't collected at a later date and moved somewhere else. The YouTube channel Plunder recently made an interesting video covering this aspect, and I'm going to take it a little bit further in this video. Her video includes interesting footage where Andy Moorman describes Barry setting camera traps, carrying a shotgun over his shoulder, and warning searchers that they were about to set foot on private property. So that would have been one area Andy's search team would have missed. When Barry sold the house, if Suzanne's remains were on the adjacent property, would he have left them there? Well, not if he owned other properties, which we know he did, and there are some indications that there were subsequent alerts on at least one of these additional properties. So the question we're going to pose in this video is it unusual for a suspect to move human remains when there's an active search going on? Well, what do you think Letitia Stork did? There are some other fascinating instances of cadaver alerts in some criminal cases over a broad range of territories and timelines. But before we get to that, I want to pose a question that has sort of been coming up a little bit. You know, you have this idea of Barry as a controlling figure, and there's recently been the charge or allegation of domestic violence. So I wonder whether there were grudges in the family. I wonder whether there were grudges between some of the siblings, perhaps the parents-in-law, similar to what you had to some extent in the Chris Watts case. Do any of you know about that? Were there any grudges over business issues or money or anything like that? Because often in a scenario that ends like this, you have something like that percolating in the background. So it would be interesting to know for sure. Before we get to today's episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So as a way to illustrate what could have happened in this case, we're going to go the intertextual route, and we're going to look at a fellow called Eugene Zapata. And that in itself, the way we come to this case is actually fascinating. There is an article in the Madeleine McCann case just saying that the McCanns, in order to defend themselves against cadaver alerts that were kind of implicating them, they wanted to go to case law, which is the legal version of intertextuality. And they found the Zapata case, which at that time the judge had dismissed the cadaver alerts as unreliable, right? So that is just so fascinating, is that at that particular legal juncture, the McCanns turned to the Zapata case for reinforcement. And at the time, the legal narrative suited their version of events, which is that cadaver alerts are unreliable. And the reason they thought they were unreliable was that in the Zapata case, the man's wife had disappeared and the cadaver dogs were alerting sort of all over the place and just seemed unlikely. Why would they alert in the basement? Why would they alert in a storage locker? Why would they alert on another property over there? It just seemed as though the dogs were unreliable, but were they? And so at the time, this supported the McCann's argument that the dogs in their story were unreliable as well. But then things changed. Circumstances changed in the Zapata case, and Eugene Zapata confessed in a similar way to Crystal Kenny. And what then happened was all of the little aspects in the disposal of his wife then lined up perfectly with the cadaver dog alerts. So you can get the whole narrative, and I'll put a link in the description from Madison.com, and just think about how it lines up with the possibly lines up with the Morphew case as well. So the narrative begins that the Zapatas were getting divorced, so that was already in motion, and Eugene Zapata wasn't supposed to be at home, except at times that the judge approved of him being there to pick up the children. So I think he was actually home when he shouldn't have been there. And then what happened was an argument ensued between him and his wife Jeanette, and the argument became heated, but apparently not violent. Now you must bear in mind, a lot of this is based on Zapata's confession, and obviously he's going to confess in a way that is going to attempt to minimize what he did, but also provide some factual congruency to what they know. So his story was that his wife went into the kitchen, and then he picked up a rectangular draftsman weight and used that which is used to hold down blueprints, and struck her hard on the head from behind, right? Now, I've already said that you don't necessarily have a single murder weapon in a case. In other words, it's not necessarily just a gun or just a knife or just strangling. You can have an impact wound, such as you have in this case, followed by something secondary. And I don't know why, but I suspect something like that may have happened in the Morphew case. It's a gut feeling. I could be wrong. So in this case, she was struck at the back of her head hard, probably more than once, on the top and back of her head, and she didn't see the attack coming. She then fell to the floor and hit the dishwasher door on the way down. Now, I think one reason why I don't even think that this version is true, meaning that according to Zapata he snapped, is that if he snapped, would it not have been a sort of a random, instantaneous lashing out from him to her directly? The fact that it's from behind, to me, suggests premeditation, which is the same thing you have in the Durst case as well with Susan Berman. In that case, it's also a case where they say she didn't see her attacker coming. And so I wouldn't be surprised if it's premeditated and he had some other motive, and there was no argument. It was something more to do with wanting custody of the children, bearing in mind that was going on. The whole thing about, the approval, he needed the approval of a judge to pick up their children. He probably didn't like that, right? So according to his story, she fell to the floor and hit the dishwasher door on the way down, and then he strangled her. He says he strangled her until his hands hurt, and then on top of that, he wrapped a cord around her neck to make sure that she was no longer alive. Now, if you take all of those things, none of those really stack up to a person snapping. It's possible, but you would imagine that he would wake up out of this rage and not just continue. So this is a scenario of multiple murder weapons. It's the weight that he uses, the draftsman's weight. He uses his own hands, and then he also uses a cord, right? And in any event, whether the murder was random or premeditated, it's difficult to say for certain. But the point is, Suzanne could also have been struck by something and then strangled. It could also have been something like a blow or a fall followed by strangulation. Kaiser said that Zapata wrapped Jeanette Zapata's body in a poplin tent, right? And so in that kind of canvas material, then took it to his car and then drove to a farm field near Madison, right? So that was his first. Now, bear in mind, her body was never found. This is his confession. And I believe the disposal is true. The story of the disposal is true. So the way that he dealt with this was he removed her body from the home, put it in a tent which has some waterproofing and weatherproofing, took it to his car and disposed of her in a farm field near Madison. And then in 1977 he bought vacant land in Juneau County. Does that ring a bell? Vacant land. And then he moved her body there, where it stayed until 2005. Now, bear in mind, in a scenario where there's vacant land, it's private property, nothing is going on there, it's just an empty piece of land. And would there be any reason for anyone to go there? Well, I think in a situation like that, when someone's spouse disappears, you probably want to check what properties they own, in particular vacant land. And I think that is what happened in the Morphew case. And weren't there alerts on those? Weren't there some? Didn't the dog show some interest on this property owned by Barry Morphew? In any event, going back to the Zapata story, then he and his current wife Joan decided to move to Nevada and sell the land. What do you think happened after that? Now, bear in mind, in the Morphew story, there's also the selling of the Puma Path home, right? I also think he was talking about moving to Arizona, right? So what happened? Zapata dug up Jeanette Zapata's remains and moved them to a storage locker in Sun Prairie with some camping equipment. So you probably have this perception that, oh, he's moving camping equipment into the storage locker. Now, in the Morphew case, you also have things like equipment. You have the equipment that he uses for the landscaping. You have tools. And you have a similar scenario in the Watts case where he talks about, oh no, he was moving tools into the back of his truck and into his truck on the day that he removed their remains or moved them from his home to the well site, right? And so in other words, you have this this plausible deniability of moving heavy objects, tools, equipment, when you're actually moving something else. So in any event, in 2005, he disposed of the remains in several dumpsters at the Juneau County landfill. District Attorney Brian Blanchard said that although the police searched the landfill the following year, no new search for remains was made after Zapata's statement. You've got to bear in mind it's very difficult for cadaver dogs to search a landfill because of the flux of debris and everything that's there. And things get filled in, you know, it could be buried very deep down. But the bottom line is that although evidence was excluded from Zapata's first trial, police said that cadaver dogs indicated the scent of human remains at the Indian Trace home and 2 other homes occupied by Zapata, as well as the storage locker and rental car. Let me just say that again. So cadaver dogs in that case found human remains at the Indian Trace home, I believe it was in the basement, that's 1. 2 other homes, that's 2, 3, occupied by Zapata, as well as a storage locker, that's 4, and a rental car, that's 5. So in other words, that is at least 5 different times that the human remains were transferred and ultimately never found, right? His wife's remains were never found. And so what that is showing is this is one example of how to get rid of human remains permanently where they never discovered, is by moving them quite a few times, and then bear in mind right at the end they were dispersed in several dumpsters. So there had to be some kind of sequestrating or separating of the remains into some smaller volume of it. And so there you have it. And it is really fascinating that the dogs were actually right before this guy gave his confession. So prior to Zapata's statement, the cadaver alerts in the basement where Zapata killed his wife, so he initially I think hid her there before moving her to the car. were actually initially dismissed wrongly by a trial judge. But his confession proved the dogs had been right all along, despite the seeming impossibility of cadaver alerts all over the place in the Zapata case. By the way, in terms of that basement alert, I don't know for sure. I don't know the Zapata case all that well. I think her body was in 3 different houses at 3 different times, and I assume in the basement of one of those homes. I just know there was a basement alert at some point. In the Morphew case, we see many similarities in terms of the access to different properties, potentially allowing a relay for disposal. Does that make sense? So a question that definitely comes up is if Barry Morphew was involved, and this whole story about Andy Moorman doing this big search and then Barry sort of intimidating him, or basically just letting him know that he's about to trespass, that he was setting up camera traps and he had a shotgun over his shoulder. Was that a misdirection? Was that done to make you think that there was something there? It's quite a difficult one, but I tend to think that that Barry didn't want people looking on his property, and if there was nothing to hide, then he would have allowed people onto his property. I think if he had the choice, a scenario where he would want no one to look on the property and he had nothing to hide and they wouldn't find anything, or a scenario where he had something to hide, I would imagine that he would prefer letting people look if they weren't going to find anything. So aren't the odds that there possibly was something to find at a particular point on the property, somewhere on the property, but no longer? And if you look at the kind of work that he did, he's a landscaper. He knows how to open up the earth and close the earth. He knows how to patch up the earth. He knows how to do that in an efficient way. That's his expertise. You have something similar in the Chad Daybell case, potentially, where you have had a guy who was previously a grave digger. And what does he have on his property? Well, he has a pet cemetery. An ex-grave digger has a pet cemetery, and then ultimately the human remains of 2 individuals are found, given another missing persons case. Can you see how you have that kind of overlap? So I mentioned a couple of cases where human remains were never ultimately found. The Zapata case is one. Another case that's almost at that point is the Patrick Frazee case, where they did find a little tooth fragment belonging to a woman. That was all they really found of Kelsey Bereth. And then there's also the Madeleine McCann case. Now, what I think is very interesting in all 3 of those cases is, although the human remains explicitly were never found and have never been found, what were found in all 3 cases, or what did occur in all 3 cases, were cadaver dogs alerted. In other words, human remains weren't completely eviscerated. What did remain was that distinctive odor. So despite all of that effort in all 3 of those cases to get rid of a person, this distinctive odor stayed behind, and so that was kind of a tiny fragment, basically just a little bit of gas, a bit of a smell of what used to be a person remained, and the dogs were able to find that. Isn't that amazing? And the question is, has that happened in the Morphew case as well? Now, I do know there are a lot of people that keep referring me to other channels saying, do you know about this, do you know about that? I am aware of that. I tend to want to focus on what the mainstream media say and also what law enforcement says. I don't really like going the route of social media. I'm sure there's a lot of valuable stuff there, but there's also a lot of nonsense there. There are some channels that know what they're talking about, and there are some that go off the rails, as we all know. So I appreciate a lot of you guys directing me to this channel and that channel, but you know, I want to be a separate voice, and I certainly don't want to just go to another channel and, you know, I don't know, take notes and then repeat what they say, right? I'm doing my own sort of investigation, right? Obviously, where people speak firsthand, where it's Barry Morphew or Susan's relatives, that is very useful, where you get those sort of statements firsthand. That is always very useful. But an example of what I'm talking about is you had this parallel investigation by Andy Moorman, and I'm not saying that it wasn't useful, but there was talk about cadaver alerts in that search, and the only question I've got regarding that is, if you had these confirmed cadaver alerts, why wouldn't Barry Morphew have been arrested then? Because that's really how it works. In the Chris Watts case, the cadaver dogs came into his home and they got one strong alert, but then they couldn't confirm it with the second dog, and so they weren't sure what to do, which is why he wasn't arrested Tuesday night or Tuesday. So in the absence of a body, you need a confirmed cadaver alert. It could also be that the sheriff decided on that sort of slow approach and keeping the cards close to his chest. But in my view, and this is just my opinion, if you've got a confirmed cadaver alert and a missing person, then at the moment you get that confirmed alert is a good time to arrest your suspect. Now, it could be they still needed additional kind of inculpatory evidence, meat and potatoes. Perhaps things were developing with a particular person or the sale of a property. Those things are all possible. All I'm saying is if you have a separate search team, let's say an unofficial search team, coming up with cadaver alerts, and there's not an arrest at that time, then I think that calls into question the relevance or possibly the reliability of the alert. And I can sort of feel some of you objecting to this, so let me put the ball in your court. You have a search, lots of people, hundreds of people, you're looking for Suzanne, you have cadaver dogs and they alert. Okay, so then why not take that and do something with it? You've found apparently human remains, or where they were. That's almost the most important thing to find in the situation. So why would you not take that and then immediately have an arrest? Why did so many months go by after that? And so I think the question, or the answer to that question, is either that the alerts were unreliable or irrelevant, or if they weren't, and I think that's also possible, they weren't unreliable. If they were relevant and they were reliable, there was still not enough to bring charges. Or it could also have been that the DA at the time was someone who didn't really think anything of that, and also perhaps wanted far more evidence, etc., etc., etc. Almost like a John Benet Ramsey district attorney scenario. And so you're never going to be satisfied that there was enough evidence. It could be that as well. We'll probably know more when the affidavit comes out. I think the interesting thing in that will be, especially in the area of cadaver dogs and the disposal story, because that remains a mystery, doesn't it? The other thing to bear in mind is, as soon as you have a scenario where there's a transfer of human remains from one point to another point, then you tend to have a vehicle involved. And so that then adds to another possible site where you can have cadaver odor. And I don't know whether the chemicals, the chlorine that was used in the Morphew case, whether that was used to clean equipment or bags or the truck. I don't know, but you can certainly imagine that could be what that might be used for, because once you have human remains in a vehicle, you're definitely going to smell them. You had that scenario in the Casey Anthony case. You had it in the Madeleine McCann case, and it also comes up in the Letitia Stork case. So as soon as you have this possibility of the transfer of human remains, then you want to look at the vehicles. You want to put the dogs inside the vehicles. And we know in this case that there are a number of vehicles involved as well. I know one of the creators spoke about Barry's acquired, all sorts of vehicles, so that also makes it quite a lot more complicated. You had Letitia Stork doing exactly the same thing, renting quite a few vehicles one after the other. Okay, I'm not going to take it further than that. Tomorrow, which is Saturday, I'll be doing a live stream dealing with the tricky topic of when did the premeditation start. And so that is something I'll be talking to you guys about, hopefully getting your feedback in a live stream. You're welcome to bring all your questions in terms of this case. And that is at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time tomorrow. If you're not sure what time it is in your area, just Google 2 p.m. EST. Put those words in your browser and just enter it and Google it, and you'll get the time in your time zone. I think it's 7 p.m. in the UK. On Sunday, I'm going to be talking about the 96 Everest disaster, 5 of the crucial errors that Scott Fisher made, and then also dealing with a very controversial scene in the Everest movie that is dealt with both by Krakauer and by Beaucrief. And I'm going to leave it to you guys to decide what you think really happened. So 2, I think, interesting live streams coming up this weekend. The Sunday live stream also at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do. And I'll see you guys next time.